Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to be exploring the truly fascinating science and the history behind how we make the decisions that matter the most. Now, obviously, we make choices every single day, right? But there is a very specific class of choice, the slow, deliberative, highly consequential kind, that literally shapes the trajectory of our lives and our societies. And yet, if you think about it, we rarely ever stop to look at the actual mechanics of how we make them. So let's dive right into this to really get to the bottom of how we make these monumental choices. And honestly, why we're sometimes so terrible at it. We're going to zoom way back in time. We're going to look at a truly shocking historical blunder. It's a story that perfectly captures what happens when a society just completely fails to grasp the long-term impact of its actions. And we're heading to a place you definitely recognize today, but we're looking at a version of it that has been entirely erased from the map. Picture this. 10,000 years ago, glacial melt created this pristine, freshwater oasis right in lower Manhattan called Collect Pond. Fed by underground springs, it was a spectacular natural feature. In fact, the Lenape people could cross the island by canoe at high tide. And by the early 18th century, it had become this tranquil, idyllic ice skating haven for the city's youth. It was, for all intents and purposes, a beautiful ecological marvel sitting right in the middle of a booming trade center. But fast forward to 1798, and things took a really dark turn. Commercial tanneries had effectively turned the city's main drinking supply into a toxic nightmare. This visceral quote from a local pamphlet honestly says it all, describing the water as being filled with all the leakings, scrapings, scourings, pissings, and shittings for a great distance around. These tanneries had literally set up shop right on the edge of the pond. They were soaking animal hides in poisonous chemicals and dumping their waste directly into the fresh water. The wetlands around it, they just became a massive dumping ground. It was an absolute, unmitigated ecological disaster. So what we have here is a massive tragedy of the commons, all because people failed to deliberately evaluate the long-term consequences. Actually, scratch that. They did have a chance. Back in 1789, Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, the guy who would later design Washington, D.C., proposed a brilliant plan to turn the pond into a preserved public park. But short-sighted real estate speculators just shot it down. Instead, the city decided to flatten a nearby hill and bury the pond entirely. Now, as you might guess, burying nature rarely works out. The decaying organic matter underneath the soil caused the new houses built on top to physically sink into the ground, releasing these incredibly putrid smells. Wealthy residents immediately fled, property values tanked, and the area rapidly deteriorated into the infamous 5-Point slum. It became a place of unimaginable squalor. It was so violent and so densely packed with human misery that Charles Dickens wrote about it with utter horror when he visited in the 1840s. As Stephen Johnson points out in his book, destroying this ecological marvel was a staggering 500-year mistake. Now, thankfully today, we have things like environmental impact studies to prevent exactly this kind of thing. Nowadays, we'd convene stakeholders, we'd host collaborative urban planning sessions, we'd run complex economic analyses. We wouldn't just dump a bunch of dirt on our only freshwater source and cross our fingers. The ability to make these deliberative, long-term decisions is one of the truly unique characteristics of our species. And the good news is, we are definitely getting better at it. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. Let's move from the macro-level decisions of city planning all the way down to the micro-level decisions of an individual life. We're going to jump across the Atlantic to July 1838, where 29-year-old Charles Darwin was facing a very different, incredibly intimate kind of choice. Darwin had recently returned from his legendary global voyage on the HMS Beagle, and he's literally just months away from sketching out the very first outlines of his theory of natural selection. But before publishing the theory that would absolutely change the world, Darwin was wrestling with a deeply personal, existential question. Should I get married? This was a choice that was going to profoundly alter his daily routines, his financial stability, and honestly, his mental bandwidth for scientific discovery. So how exactly does a world-renowned genius of the scientific method tackle this kind of life-altering puzzle? Well, it is just fascinating to see a historical icon struggle with highly relatable, almost comical pros and cons. He literally took out his journal, divided the facing pages into 2 columns, and mapped out all of his anxieties. On the merry side, he wrote about wanting a constant companion, noting that a wife is, and I quote, better than a dog anyhow, which, wow, such a romantic sentiment from the great biologist. But over on the not merry side, he was really stressing about the loss of his time, the looming expense of having kids, and missing out on the conversation of clever men at clubs. He even completely catastrophized, worrying that if his new wife didn't like living in London, it would mean banishment and degradation into indolent, idle fool. But here is the kicker. Even though he actually ended up listing 5 more entries in the not marry column, his internal emotional accounting pushed him the other way. Just 6 months later, he married Emma Wedgwood. At the very bottom of his notes, he enthusiastically scribbled, "Marry, marry, marry, QED." You see, he didn't just blindly count the length of the lists, he intuitively weighted the arguments. He decided that having a lifelong companion and children mattered way more in the grand scheme of his life than, hanging out with clever men at clubs. Now, Darwin's whole 2-column technique actually traces its roots back a bit further. It goes back to some career advice Benjamin Franklin gave half a century earlier to a British chemist named Joseph Priestley. Back in 1772, Priestley was completely agonizing over whether to uproot his family for a lucrative but potentially risky job offer from the Earl of Shelburne. So Priestley writes to his good friend Benjamin Franklin for some guidance. And Franklin, being the absolute master of self-improvement that he was, didn't tell Priestley what to decide. Instead, he taught him how to decide. Franklin's method was a lot more than just a simple pros and cons list. It was a genuinely actionable mathematical framework for carefully weighing competing motives. First, Franklin advised writing down the different motives over 3 or 4 days. Because, let's be real, our brains can rarely hold all the variables at once. But step 3 is where the real magic happens. He told Priestley to estimate the respective weights of these motives. If you find one pro that is equal in importance to 2 cons, you physically cross all 3 out. You just keep eliminating variables, canceling them against one another until you finally see exactly where the true balance lies. And this brilliantly illustrates why Franklin called his technique moral algebra. It's a cognitive tool designed to ensure we aren't just swayed by whichever emotion happens to be front of mind at that exact moment. It takes the subjective, messy, highly emotional state of making a tough decision and applies this clarifying, almost algebraic precision to it. It forces you to hit pause, externalize your thoughts on paper, and evaluate them systematically over time, rather than just acting on some fleeting impulse. But think about this for a second. Despite the undeniable importance of these far-sighted choices, there is a massive gap in how we prepare people to make them today. Just think about all the huge crossroads in your own life. Major career changes, agonizing medical choices, figuring out who to marry, or even public decisions like voting on a multi-million-dollar local bond measure. Most of us just rely on background mulling and maybe some informal chats with our friends. Our decision-making techniques haven't really evolved past what Darwin was scribbling in his notebook almost 200 years ago. We spend literally years teaching students how to solve complex math equations or write computer code. Our modern education system is just packed with these highly specialized technical skills, from factoring quadratic equations to diagramming the cell cycle. Yet we dedicate almost zero formal education to the actual craft of making complex, long-term life choices. A class strictly devoted to the science of decision-making, it's practically non-existent. We essentially leave people to figure out the single most impactful skill of their lives completely on their own. And, even modern behavioral economics overwhelmingly focuses on the quick, irrational flash judgments. You've probably heard of Daniel Kahneman's incredible work, dividing the brain into System 1, which is our fast, intuitive reactions, and System 2, our slow, conscious deliberation. But if you look at the best-selling books and the clinical research from the last few decades, they are almost entirely focused on System 1. They show us how we're manipulated by optical illusions, or quick brand judgments, or predatory mortgages. And don't get me wrong, these are absolutely vital insights, but they are tested using abstract, rapid-fire puzzles, like blackjack-style wagers, that fit easily into a 1-hour laboratory experiment. They completely ignore the slow, deliberative choices that actually define who we are. Because the choices that matter most, whether that's deciding to build a public park that will last for centuries or embarking on a marriage that will define your personal history, you just cannot replicate those by placing bets at a lab-tested blackjack table. They require mapping, predicting, and a deliberate moral algebra. So I'll leave you with this final thought. If our most monumental choices dictate the entire course of our lives and our cities, isn't it time we finally mastered the science of the slow decision?